It's October 2010, and I am playing video games, when suddenly I remember the DVD I rented from the library is due back tomorrow. That movie is The Manchurian Candidate, and I am not particularly excited to watch it. I don't know much about the film beyond that it's a political thriller from the 1960s, and that sounds boring. It's probably about an election or something. I'd rather do something totally absent of politics, like continue playing Call of Duty. Better judgment wins out, however, and I decide to give the film a shot. Within minutes, I find myself captivated. The film opens in the Korean War, immediately establishing Sergeant Raymond Shaw's frosty demeanor and hostile relationship with his fellow soldiers. Interpersonal conflict quickly takes a back seat, however, when the troop is betrayed by their Korean guide, taken captive by communist soldiers, and airlifted to an unknown location as the opening titles begin. Already, I'm hooked by the simple yet direct character development, by the guide's treachery, and by the intrigue of why the men have been captured and what fate could possibly await them. The film, seemingly aware of the grip it has on me at this point, begins to withhold answers, jumping ahead to Raymond and the bulk of his troops home safely in America. Documentary-like voiceover dryly informs me that Raymond has been celebrated for single-handedly saving his men and leading the patrol back to safety.
Displaying valor above and beyond the call of duty, did single-handedly save the lives of 9 members of his patrol, capturing an enemy machine gun nest and taking out in the process a full company of enemy infantry.
But that blatantly contradicts what the film has shown. Something isn't right. Sure enough, fellow survivor Marco's nightmares reveal something far more sinister happened when the men were captured. The dream is odd. It starts with the soldiers absent-mindedly on a stage as part of a women's gardening club lecture on horticulture. But a pan through the room brings us to a new stage. The men surrounded by images of communist leaders, and a lecturer explaining he has conditioned the Americans.
Or brainwashed them, which I understand is the new American word.
As the film crosscuts between the women's club and sinister military brass. It takes me a minute to fully grasp what I'm seeing, but when I do, my jaw hits the floor. The boundaries between the men's brainwashed illusion and the harsh reality they're trapped in only blur further as the scene progresses. The cuts which alternate perspectives become more frequent, and elements from fantasy and reality occupy the same frame concurrently. This eerie merger, and the nonchalance with which the brainwashing is explained, culminates in a chilling moment where Raymond obediently follows instruction and murders squadmate Edma Voley with dispassionate efficiency. I'm about 18 minutes in at this point, and I realize The Manchurian Candidate is unlike any movie I've ever seen, and I'm desperate to see where it's going. The preceding hour and 49 minutes do not disappoint. I am spellbound, not only by the high concept of brainwashed assassins and espionage, but the character drama. Raymond's twisted relationship to his domineering mother, Mrs. Iselin, his summer love affair, which ended in heartbreak, and the slow friendship which develops between he and Marco. Even the political aspects that seemed so unappealing to me are in fact fascinating, especially how Mrs. Iselin puppeteers her blowhard husband as a tool to amass power. Each of these threads weaves together in a mounting paranoia, a sense that evil is so deeply embedded within the world that it's impossible to ever be free of its influence. This is evident in the ending, which I dare not spoil, but suffice it to say, the sheer power of the story's conclusion, where even a victory is marred by tragedy, left me in complete awe. I'm not sure I can overstate how formative an experience watching The Manchurian Candidate as a teenager was for me. This was the first time I was really conscious of the fact that not only could a movie's formal elements be used to tell a story, but could actively deceive me by blurring perspectives. I didn't know the word diegesis, but I was certainly aware that the film's internal reality was less assured than I was used to. It was one of the first times I saw a film bridge a plethora of disparate genres and formats into a cohesive whole, cribbing from war epics, science fiction, spy movies, and drama, but also documentary and TV news. It was also a key moment in reconsidering my own preconceived notions about movies. I was so dismissive of The Manchurian Candidate, sight unseen, purely because of my own ignorant presumptions about what a political thriller even was in the first place. Given even the smallest chance, I quickly fell in love. Perhaps it would be beneficial to be more open. And to that point, The Manchurian Candidate was also the first old movie that I unequivocally loved. I had certainly seen a smattering of classic family films like The Wizard of Oz and stuff from Disney, and I was also a pretty dedicated James Bond fan, so it's not like I only watched movies from the 2000s. Hell, Dr. No was literally released the same year as The Manchurian Candidate. But all the same, this marked a pivotal stepping stone in my cinephilia. There's a big difference between old kids' movies or the old entries in a still very modern film franchise and old movies unambiguously made for adults, and The Manchurian Candidate was my gateway to the latter. The moment where watching classic movies stopped being strictly an academic exercise and became something I did for fun. But by now, you might be wondering, if I was so disinterested in watching The Manchurian Candidate, why did I rent it in the first place? Well, because it ranked 67th in the AFI's list of the top 100 best American movies. The American Film Institute is a non-profit dedicated to film education, but is most widely known for their public honors, like the annual AFI Lifetime Achievement Award and their top 100 lists, beginning in 1998 with a ranking of the 100 greatest American movies ever made. The list was unveiled in a 3-hour TV special, and supported by a follow-up series elaborating on the films in more detail, plus a home video promotional tie-in supported by both outlets like Blockbuster and the studios themselves. I missed all this hoopla at the time, on account of being 3, but the list proved tremendously useful when I became a teenager looking to expand my knowledge of movies. There were certainly other, more recent lists I could have used as a guide, most obviously the IMDb Top 250 movies. I remember skimming that list a couple times, but that it was user-voted meant picks were constantly changing, and also that high-profile new releases would frequently shoot their way into the top 10. That seemed counterproductive, when my primary goal was to discover older movies I wasn't being exposed to. At some point, I also got wise to the fact that the Sight and Sound poll was the far more prestigious honor, but the movies across their top 10 lists were a lot more intimidating for a novice. Keep in mind that at 15, I had seen very little classic cinema. Even common entry points like Hitchcock or Akira Kurosawa were total blind spots. I was not ready to just jump into Battleship Potemkin or L'Avventura. The AFI Top 100 was a lot more accessible. That I had actually seen a handful of the films already provided some common ground, and most of the movies were also available on DVD through my city's library. The list certainly wasn't the only tool which guided my teen film viewing, but it was an essential one, introducing me to new cinematic pleasures and possibilities. No, not every movie gave me the same euphoria that The Manchurian Candidate did, not by a long shot, but the experience did fundamentally shape my ideas of what movies were and what they could be. For that reason, I have a lot of nostalgic fondness for the AFI Top 100, and how it helped shape my cinematic framework. But that position is by no means universal. Critical reception of the list back in 1998 was overwhelmingly negative. To some extent, that was inevitable. Any effort to name the best of anything invites cries of "what about X" for any notable omissions, and the AFI list had plenty of omissions, the most commonly cited being the complete lack of Buster Keaton, Ernst Lubitsch, and Preston Sturges. I get that criticism, especially the lack of Keaton, but I'm also inclined to defend the AFI here. 100 is ultimately a very small number, and no combination of 100 movies could fully convey the best of American cinema. Some things were always going to be excluded. But there were deeper criticisms of the AFI, from their motivations and methodology to the broader implications of the list, particularly how it might influence the film canon. Well, no time like the original list's 26th anniversary to revisit these issues. In this video, we'll examine the AFI's top 100 movies and consider what the list says about film history, how its canonizing efforts influenced film culture, and what use the list might still have today. But first, we need to address what the film canon even is. Canon refers to the essential texts within an art form. The classics, the best, the most influential and most historically significant works as determined by the culture. I say the culture because no one group decides what is and isn't canon. The selections emerge from a combination of sources: critical praise, scholars and teachers writing in the field or developing syllabi for teaching students, awards recognition, influence cited by fellow artists, even popularity with the general public, all have varying degrees of sway. The concept originates in literature, but a film canon began to emerge in the 20th century as the medium itself developed. As Janet Steiger notes in her 1985 essay, The Politics of Film Canon, much of the early writing on the cinema involved proving film was an art form, and the films cited as pioneering artistic achievements marked the beginnings of a film canon. By 1930, Paul Rotha's book, The Film Till Now, already offered a list of outstanding films, highlighting the most exceptional work of the still young medium. At around the same time, the film industry started acknowledging its own artistic achievements through self-endorsements like the Academy Awards, its winners and nominees at least theoretically representing the best in film. The act of film criticism is inherently canonizing, elevating some movies while denouncing others, designations which only become more powerful as critics build their reputation. In 1952, British film magazine Sight and Sound would first poll critics from around the world for their selections of the greatest movies of all time, a practice that has continued every decade since. Even Andrew Sarris's overview of American auteur filmmakers, his 1968 book The American Cinema, was designed as a ranked hierarchy, sorting directors into evaluative categories. All that to say, a long history of cinematic canonization had been ongoing by the time the AFI got to their ranking in 1998. Which brings us to one of the major criticisms of the AFI's Top 100, that the list simply upheld the existing canon while making little to no effort to expand it. The focus wasn't just on American films, but Hollywood films. Most movies featured made by major Hollywood studios and otherwise embraced by the establishment, already famous, acclaimed, and awarded. Number one film Citizen Kane had already been designated the greatest movie of all time in the last 4 lists by Sight and Sound. A full 75% of the movies had been nominated for the Best Picture Oscar, and a third of the list flat out won. The films were also popular with the general public, with 66 movies which landed among the top 10 box office grossers the year of their release, and 18 being the top grossing film of its year. Only 12 films in the list failed to make either category, not among the 10 highest grossers or a Best Picture nominee, and those 12 consist primarily of movies by highly respected auteur directors or beloved genre classics. Jonathan Rosenbaum argued the list was merely concerned with, quote, selling and reselling what we already know and have, making every alternative appear more scarce and esoteric, and not even attempting to expand or illuminate the choices made in the process. Rosenbaum further states that the primary purpose of these kinds of lists should be to educate and expand possibilities for the viewer. But, quote, the sad news about the AFI's version is that it proposes we stop looking, go home, and proceed to pick more lint out of our navels for the remainder of the millennium. In other words, the AFI's picks were pretty basic, and that basicness was built into the list's very foundations. The 1,500 film industry personnel who voted on the top 100 were given a criterion for judgment, which included historical significance and influence, but also critical recognition, awards, and popularity as measured in box office dollars. On the one hand, this framework does encourage voters to think beyond their own opinions and to consider the list from a broader cultural perspective. But on the other hand, acquiescing to the judgment of major awards, critical consensus, and popularity with the general public inherently reduces the possibility for surprises and unsung gems. Compounding the issue is that those who did vote were not given a blank slate, but a pre-selected list of 400 movies to choose from. And where those movies came from is a lot less clear. Presumably, they were selected by some person or group from within the AFI, likely working with a similar criterion that the voters were, but that's just speculation. Whatever the case, the list breakdown privileging the already acknowledged American cinema was clearly a desired outcome, and that starts to make a lot of sense when you know the motivations for the list's creation in the first place. Throughout the 90s, the AFI had its funding slashed considerably. According to the Chicago Tribune, the National Endowment for the Arts, which used to provide the AFI with millions of dollars in annual grant money, had been reduced to about $100,000 a year. The list was essentially a fundraising opportunity, with a big TV special and accompanying miniseries to rake in ad revenue. And the AFI wasn't the only one who got in on the marketing. The studios whose films were selected allowed the AFI to use clips in their broadcast for free. Usually, licensing film footage costs an arm and a leg, but it's likely that the studios saw the special as free advertising. Convenient, given every film in the list was available on home video. And hey, where are people gonna have to rent those tapes but Blockbuster, who offered a promotional tie-in, while movie channels like TCM also ran programming tie-ins. This was a massive event, and it wasn't going to be maintained on the back of the obscure and esoteric. You really get the sense of the whole effort being one big commercial when you watch the Top 100 special. I had never seen it before, but watched it in prep for this video, and yeah, it's terrible. Smothered in insufferable magic of movies schmaltz and fluff comments that say almost nothing of substance. Most movies only get 90 seconds tops before moving on to the next entry, and a lot of that time is eaten up by just showing clips. Occasionally, you'll have someone like Scorsese giving salient historical analysis, or filmmakers offering insight into their own creative process, but moments like this are few and far between. The Vertigo section is carried by Charlton Heston, who says nothing at all about the film and instead reminisces about Jimmy Stewart talking about movie moments, while vaguely referring to a scene from the film. A lot of movies are summarized to single scenes, in fact. We're told the Russian roulette scene in The Deer Hunter is punishing, or the beach kiss in From Here to Eternity is sexy. The beauty and brutality of Raging Bull is reduced to being a film about the human spirit, which, I suppose is technically true, but that doesn't really tell you much about what the film is or why it's special. King Kong is discussed by Donald Trump, which is especially loathsome now for obvious reasons, and all he has to say is that he watched the movie because he owns the land the Empire State Building sits on. No comment on the film's ambitious special effects or its status as a landmark monster movie, or its enduring influence on escapist filmmaking. 22 seconds to show some clips, and for Trump to make a stupid comment. On to the next movie. Entry 67, The Manchurian Candidate, the movie that changed my life. There's so much you could say here. You could talk about how the film responded to Cold War paranoia, or its eerie mirror of the many political assassinations in the years to follow, or how it wrote the playbook for the paranoia thriller of the 1970s a full decade in advance. You could talk about the brilliant editing in the brainwashing scene, or Angela Lansbury's terrifying villain and the perverse psychosexual tensions the film draws between her and her son. Or you could just say that it's a great thriller with a bizarre and compelling story. What does the AFI give us? Sam Jackson says he doesn't know anything about espionage or assassination, but he knows a little bit about hypnotism from watching Ed Sullivan. Why even say anything at all? Honestly, watching this thing really crystallizes why critics were so hostile back in 1998, because the context of this special makes the list so much worse. And the thing that really galls me is that a lot of these movies could use some context to help new viewers. A Streetcar Named Desire is a great movie, but a lot of what makes it great requires a bit of history. Knowing how deftly Elia Kazan is navigating Hays Code censorship standards, or how the character conflict between Blanche and Stanley is fueled by a mix of old Hollywood gravitas and New York-inspired method acting, not only makes the movie better, but it also helps it make sense. If you don't have that context, the movie's story and characters can just seem kind of odd. That's certainly how it felt to me as a teenager. The AFI could have helped its audiences out a little bit, but instead speaks vaguely to how the film captured the South and then moves on. But despite a rather lackluster broadcast, the AFI Top 100 Movies was successful. Certainly for the AFI, who spent the next decade cranking out annual Top 100 specials, including a revised Best of All Time in 2007. It was also influential with the public. Metrics indicating the films featured in the list saw a massive boost in video rentals, especially Citizen Kane. It had enough pull that I used it as a guide long after publication, and I know I'm not alone there. I certainly know friends who did the same, and when I polled my audience on Twitter and YouTube, about a quarter of participants said they looked to the list in their formative cinephile years. Hell, in 2018, the AFI's revised list inspired a hit podcast, where the hosts went through and evaluated the movies selected. Unspooled took a very critical attitude towards the list, similar to the press reception to the first list back in '98, but that engagement does speak to a lasting legacy. Disreputable though it may have been, the AFI Top 100 Movies did contribute to the film canon, not through addition, as Rosenbaum lamented, but through reinforcement. The continuing presence of Citizen Kane as number one is especially crucial, not only helping to solidify the film's legacy, but also the AFI's credibility. That the more populist AFI ultimately came to the same conclusion as the highbrow critics of Sight and Sound legitimized the former, granting the whole list a sense of prestige despite the shallowness of the presentation. The overall effect was a confirmation, the AFI essentially saying, yes, this is the American film canon. Which brings us to another question. Is the canon even a good thing in the first place? One thing I neglected to mention when defining canon is that the concept had fallen under increasing scrutiny throughout the 20th century and beyond. Critics of the canon argue the concept elitist and inherently exclusionary, elevating a select few works into a realm of importance and devaluing others. In doing so, the canon turns art into homework. To quote Adrian Martin, Everyone knows that when young students sit down to watch a film thinking, oh, this is some old classic that I am supposed to appreciate as a great work of art, they are already dead to what the film can offer them. They're shut down, closed off, and bored before the projector even beams. I don't think Martin gives the movies enough credit to break through this mummification. I certainly went into The Manchurian Candidate treating it like homework, but that attitude quickly melted away when I started watching the movie. Still, I get Martin's point. Citizen Kane has so long been christened the greatest movie of all time that it's taken this aura of solemn importance and austerity, when in fact the film is a rousing entertainment, full of humor and music and scandalous drama, a big story that's still contained in a 2-hour runtime which flies by. It's fun, but its reputation as the best film elides that, its canonization almost serving as a hindrance. The benefit of Kane's canonization is how it is selected as a movie people should see. That's what the canon does. It designates which art people should engage with and which art they should ignore. And a lot of the art the canon tells you to ignore, the canon critics tell us, are the works made by women and people of color. The canon becomes the canon of dead white men, a collection of work which aspires to a transcendent artistry, but still reflects the political biases of the culture. These criticisms are certainly applicable to the AFI. While their top 100 movies are largely populist and not elitist in the highbrow intelligentsia sense of the word, they are elitist in their privileging of Hollywood productions. Only movies with substantial capital invested into budget, distribution, and studio-backed home video releases are allowed to be deemed the great movies. The top 100 is also made up exclusively by films directed by white men, which surprisingly went largely unacknowledged in the press of 1998. For all the hostility the AFI encountered, no story that I could find from the list's release explicitly called out the gendered and racial bias of directors. The closest I found was an article where Meryl Streep called the overly masculine focus a disgrace, or anger over the inclusion of The Birth of a Nation. But these were criticisms of actors in leading roles and narratives, not directorial representation. You could argue the criticism is made implicitly by Rosenbaum, whose alternative top 100 list includes 3 films directed by women and 3 films directed by black men, but he never makes this point overt. Perhaps the lack of outrage is because, in 1998, it was simply taken for granted that a list of the best American movies would inevitably privilege white men directors. The film industry has historically been racist and sexist, and any list reflecting that history will also reflect these biases. Women filmmakers and black filmmakers have always existed, even at the Hollywood level, but they are a minority. It's also worth noting how the specific criterion the AFI designed only compounded this issue. Let's focus specifically on women directors for a second. The rule that only feature films count immediately disqualifies pioneering silent filmmakers Alice Guy Blache and Lois Weber, and experimental filmmaker Maya Deren, who all worked primarily in short films. The focus on mainstream popularity and awards basically disqualifies independent filmmakers like Barbara Loden, Kathleen Collins, or Cheryl Donier. Even Ida Lupino, who did technically work within the system, did so on low budgets and in genre movies that did not garner the prestige that big Hollywood movies did. The emphasis on box office hits severely disadvantages Elaine May, whose films rarely turned a profit, and her most famous movie, especially at this time, was considered an all-time bomb. And then there's the question of access. How many of these movies were available on home video? How many were showing up on TV? To quote Donald Totoro, "It may seem tautological and obvious, but a film cannot be canonized unless it is seen frequently, continuously, and over a sustained period of time." how many films by women filmmakers were afforded those privileges. The end result is that very few movies directed by women were credible contenders. You've basically got a handful of films from Barbra Streisand and Penny Marshall, Gillian Armstrong's version of Little Women, Sleepless in Seattle, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, and maybe Dance Girl Dance and The Heartbreak Kid. Notice too that a lot of these contenders are comedies, which aren't strictly excluded from the AFI's list, but are greatly outnumbered by dramatic fare. I cite all this not to justify the AFI's exclusions, but to try and understand how they happen. How Criterion's designed without an explicitly political goal still have political ramifications. Even so, the AFI did have options. I'd like to especially call attention to She Done Him Wrong, which, yes, was technically directed by a man, but stars Mae West, was written by Mae West, was based on a play by Mae West, and includes a big credit which reads, "By Mae West." It's Mae West's movie. And what a movie! A box office hit, credited with saving Paramount, that also turned West into a movie star, and was nominated for Best Picture. It's also a historically significant movie, a defining example of the pre-code cinema of the early 1930s, and how looser censorship standards allowed filmmakers to create more salacious and sinful work. She Done Him Wrong is especially poignant in how it navigates code limitations and still emerges as a proto-feminist movie, pro-women's independence, pro-sexual liberation, even pro-sex workers. It's also got some really funny dialogue and a glorious lead performance from West.
I'm sorry you think more of your diamonds than you do of your soul.
I'm sorry you think more of my soul than you do of my diamonds.
But while women's representation in the AFI Top 100 is weak, the lack of black representation is far more damning. At least women appear in lead roles across the list. A study by Anna Cooper concluded that 29 films in the list have either gender-balanced leading roles or feature a female protagonist. That's obviously still a minority, but a substantial one with some options and variety. But only one movie features a black protagonist. Film number 99, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. And while we don't have to litigate the full complexity of its racial politics, it's worth noting moral and narrative agency rests not with Sidney Poitier's Dr. John Prentice, but Spencer Tracy as the elderly white patriarch. Meanwhile, no less than 3 films in the list feature blackface, and there are another handful of movies that could charitably be described as racially problematic. What's especially frustrating is the late 80s and 90s saw an explosion of brilliant black cinema, led by Spike Lee of course, but bolstered by films like Menace to Society, Boys in the Hood, even populist entertainments like Friday. These are films that were critically acclaimed, that did win awards, that were box office hits, and were cinematically innovative and influential. They check off every box the AFI set out to define greatness. You could argue these films were simply too recent to make the list, but I don't buy that, not when 8 movies from the 90s made the cut, with Schindler's List even cracking the top 10. And if recency bias was something the AFI wanted to account for, what about Shaft? A massively popular film which launched the blaxploitation genre, pioneered a funk film soundtrack, and marked American genre escapism's push into urban grit. If you wanted a Poitier film, what about In the Heat of the Night? The film certainly isn't exempt from similar criticisms one could also make of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, but at least Poitier has agency, and is also just cool. What about Cooley High, a popular movie which clearly influenced films like Do the Right Thing, while also telling a story of black urban life that moved away from the escapist fantasies of 70s blaxploitation? What about Sounder or Claudine? What about the many black musicals Hollywood produced as far back as the 1920s? There were options for black representation, an abundance of them in fact, almost certainly far more than I'm listing here. But the AFI chose not to honor those films. Meanwhile, the list includes a sample of overtly racist films, and while their mere presence is unpleasant, the greater failing is the AFI's complete inability to confront those racist elements. Because I think there's an argument to be made that some of these racist films do still warrant placement in the list due to their historical significance and influence. Take a movie like The Jazz Singer. A pivotal aspect of the film are protagonist Jakey Rabinowitz's multiple blackface performances, a symbol of his abandoning of Jewish roots to be a musical performer. The offensive qualities are both the visceral grotesqueness of the imagery and the implicit way the film reduces blackness to a costume, for entertaining white audiences within the diegesis, and for serving a symbolic role for the film's viewers. It's pure minstrel performance, it's disgusting, and it is extremely racist. The film is also lousy in less politically charged ways. The core conflict lacks any nuance, with a domineering father figure who hates music and disowns his son for playing jazz, and a nurturing mother who only exists to weep and look lovingly at her son. The movie can't build drama organically, so it cranks up the melodrama, with the father dying and Jakey being forced to choose between being a jazz singer or his Jewish roots. But at the very end, he just does both. It's like the ending to High School Musical 3.
I've chosen basketball, but I've also chosen theater.
So why is this racist, one-dimensional, and unconvincing drama listed as the 90th greatest American movie of all time? Almost certainly because it was the first sound film. Sound technology had been experimented with before, but The Jazz Singer was the first narrative feature to include synchronized dialogue, announcing the talkie had arrived and the silent era was over. In the next 2 years, talkies would become the default state of American movies, barring a small handful of exceptions. It's hard to imagine a more fundamental paradigm shift in film history. Beyond just being first, The Jazz Singer also utilizes its sound in impressive ways. If you watch a lot of early talkies, you'll notice an awkwardness in a lot of the performances, with actors and filmmakers struggling to figure out talking on film.
Hello, Jimmy. Say, listen, I've got the hottest pups in your life. Here's that soul.
But there's a real rhythm and smoothness to Al Jolson's words, whether in dialogue or musical numbers.
Wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you. You ain't heard nothing.
He isn't just talking, but performing with his voice. And the performance holds up. Given the film's status then as both technological breakthrough and an innovator, there's an argument that The Jazz Singer should be in the list, especially if the AFI are going to measure historical significance. But inclusion also demands responsibility from the list makers, a duty to examine, or at least acknowledge, the film's bigotry alongside its significance. And that's a problem for the AFI, as their fluff presentation makes any degree of critical introspection impossible. Instead, the AFI celebrates The Jazz Singer for its Jewish representation, and for being the first talkie. More stunning than the omission of its racism, though, the TV special actually shows Jolson's blackfacing, while Carly Simon explains how Jolson's performance inspired her to be a singer. A moment so tone-deaf, it defies explanation. The blackfacing in Yankee Doodle Dandy is ignored, which is arguably sensible, given it appears very briefly in the film, but the total absence of race in discussion of The African Queen or Gone with the Wind is a lot more egregious. Why talk about race in a Civil War epic, though, when Ted Turner can instead discuss how the film taught him the significance of land ownership? And then there's The Birth of a Nation, which is hardly discussed at all beyond being old and D.W. Griffith being a pioneer who helped invent the movies, without ever explaining how he actually did that. The film's racism is referred to, however, through the inclusion of some of the film's KKK imagery, and in Sam Jackson's vague comments that the movie probably incited people in its time, but that's what art should do, in turn sidestepping the issue completely. I also can't help but notice the cowardice of the editors using Jackson as the primary talking head for this segment as a stealth way to exonerate their celebration of a racist movie. Like, the black guy says it's okay, so we don't need to think critically about calling a movie where the KKK are heroes and black men are sexually crazed animals one of the greatest films of all time. To the AFI's credit, they do explicitly call out The Birth of a Nation as racist in their more in-depth follow-up series, where the offensive qualities of the jazz singer's blackfacing are also at least acknowledged. But these mentions are very brief. And it's not like the AFI will refuse to ever talk race. They'll go there for Guess Who's Coming to Dinner or To Kill a Mockingbird, where they can get all weepy and self-satisfied about the great white heroes who stood up against racism. But when it comes to addressing the films which perpetuate racist ideas, the AFI balks. Such introspection would get in the way of their self-congratulatory tone. These failings refer back to the deeper criticisms of the canon itself, which are many and severe. But what about the arguments for the canon? If the canon is so ripe with problems and injustices, why is it still such a powerful concept? The most common answer, echoed throughout the literature, is that the canon is necessary. There are simply too many movies for anyone to see everything for themselves. No amount of perseverance and dedication can keep up with the volume of films already made and still being released. The canon curates. It provides guidance and priorities to direct audiences in their film-going. You can try to ignore that guidance, claim that you don't care about canon and you just watch the movies that interest you, but those choices are still dictated by external factors, like accessibility, advertising, and algorithms. Which films are available to be seen and through which venues? Which films are promoted? Which filter through your algorithms to you? Canon is an effort to break out of these forces, for indeed, these forces form a canon of their own, the canon of marketing and consumerism. And that brings me to another key point. Throughout this video, I've referred to the canon, but that isn't really accurate. There is no one canon, but several. Adrian Martin outlined at least 3 major film canons, which he calls the Star Wars canon, the Citizen Kane canon, and the Kiarostami canon. The Star Wars canon refers to populist entertainments and is the realm of mainstream blockbusters. The Citizen Kane canon are the old guard classics, the formally innovative but still narratively driven films that have been honored by middlebrow critics and institutions. The Kiarostami canon is an alternative canon, a space for the extreme, the avant-garde, the underground, the bizarre. If it does feature major auteurs, it's their overlooked works. There are also genre-specific canons. You won't find any Val Lewton, John Waters, or Bud Boddicker in the AFI's Top 100, but you will inevitably find their work if you explore the history of horror, cult movies, or westerns. Canons are also culturally rooted, reflecting the tastes of a specific audience. There are queer film canons, black film canons, feminist film canons. Hell, once upon a time on this channel, we even tried to outline a film bro canon. One could also make a case for the online cinephiles canon, based on the movies film nerds champion on the internet, which I'll call the film Twitter canon. You could just take the official Letterboxd Top 250 as emblematic of that canon, but I'm thinking more specifically of movies like Miami Vice, Speed Racer, or Rob Zombie's Halloween 2. Movies that were generally dismissed by critics and audiences, but have a dedicated online fandom who passionately believe they are among the supreme cinematic achievements of the 21st century. This plurality in canons also speaks to a malleability. Take Martin's 3 film canons. Where would we place The Godfather? Its qualities seem apiece with the Citizen Kane canon, but the film was also a box office smash hit that continues to endure as a cultural touchstone and pop culture icon. So should it be in the Star Wars canon, or is it too classy for that designation? What about Lawrence of Arabia? What about Singin' in the Rain? You don't get much more populist than Gene Kelly musicals, and yet the film also came 10th in Sight and Sound's latest poll. And if the Kiarostami canon is designed as an alternative, do films become ineligible if they become more widely honored? Martin had The Night of the Hunter in his Kiarostami canon, but what happens if the film starts being celebrated by middlebrow establishments like the AFI? It's in the Criterion Collection already, and it's also in the AFI's lists of the greatest American thrillers and greatest American screen villains. Does that mean we should move it into the Citizen Kane canon? And that's the thing about canons. They change. Just ask yourself, at what point did John Carpenter become one of the great filmmakers? Most of his movies were met with mixed reviews and disappointing box office, so it wasn't the work of critics or general audiences. It certainly wasn't the Academy. In fact, the entirety of John Carpenter's filmography earned all of one Academy Award nomination, Best Actor for Jeff Bridges in Starman. It wasn't from best of lists either. The prestigious Sight and Sound series has never honored Carpenter, and across the AFI's many lists, one Carpenter movie cracked one, Halloween named the 68th greatest American thriller. But in 2024, John Carpenter is one of the most beloved directors of all time. A master of horror cinema and a brilliant craftsman. His movies are celebrated, popular, and subject to critical study. The canon had to make room for John Carpenter, and he's not alone. In the 1960s, Sergio Leone made movies for drive-ins. Decades later, he's the subject of university film courses. In 1975, Jean Dielman was a challenge to the traditional hierarchies of cinematic importance. In 2022, Sight and Sound named Jean Dielman the greatest film of all time, from disrupting the canon to being the canon. And just as some films and filmmakers are elevated into the canon, others fall out. Let's return again to the Manchurian Candidate. In his 1972 book, Hollywood in the 60s, John Baxter described the Manchurian Candidate as a key film in modern cinema, comparable to Citizen Kane in the psychological complexity of its characters, performances, and drama. High praise, and seemingly reaffirmed by the AFI, but at 67th place, the film is thoroughly lapped by several other films from that same time period. Indeed, The Manchurian Candidate is one of the lucky 12 in the top 100 to not be nominated for Best Picture or be among the top box office grossers of its year, and it's also never been honored by Sight and Sound's lists. By 2007, the film would drop entirely from the AFI's revised list. What might account for this slippage? Well, maybe it's because The Manchurian Candidate is so tapped into Cold War paranoia that the film feels less relevant to younger audiences who don't have that same cultural memory. Or maybe the paranoia thrillers The Manchurian Candidate inspired have overtaken it. The film's fiction is chilling, but is it more so than JFK's collapsing fusion of fact and fiction? I think it is, but I can see why for others, the film may have been surpassed. Or maybe this is just a byproduct of our auteur-centric film culture. John Frankenheimer has certainly made other quality films, including the excellent sci-fi thriller Seconds, but his overall legacy is that of a good journeyman director, not the kind of iconoclast auteur we tend to celebrate. To be clear, it's not like The Manchurian Candidate has completely fallen off. The film is still well regarded, still subject to contemporary analysis, and even got a Criterion release in 2016. There's also nothing stopping people from continuing to champion the film and push it back up the canon. I certainly would. I think it's one of the greatest movies ever made. But the film is a good example of how canon's status can waver. And it's not the only one. The AFI Top 100 is full of movies that drop spots between 1998 and 2007, or were left off entirely. I'm especially intrigued by The African Queen, which made it all the way to 17 in the original list. That's the highest rated John Huston movie, and it also beats anything by Hitchcock, Scorsese, Kubrick, or John Ford. Personally, I don't get it. Not because I don't like the movie. I don't like Gone with the Wind, but I understand, given its massive popularity over many decades, why it's here. But The African Queen, not only being in the list, but being as high as 17, is the kind of choice that just makes you scratch your head and ask, really?
Her?
Huston made more influential movies, and movies which did a better job blending classical studio filmmaking with adventure and exotic locations. Sam Spiegel produced grander and more exciting war epics. Humphrey Bogart and Katharine Hepburn are both good, but neither are playing fully to their strengths. Bogart works best with characters who have a darkness in them, while Hepburn thrives with an assertiveness. Charlie is a little gruff, but is mostly just nice, while Rose is defined as being prim and proper. The romance between them is fine, but the actors have a litany of great romances that put The African Queen to shame. Someone at the AFI must have agreed with me, because The African Queen had one of the steepest drops between 1998 and 2007, plummeting from 17 to 65. And if the AFI made a new top 100 tomorrow, I suspect the film wouldn't make it at all. That's partially because of my own critiques, but also the regrettable ways the film has aged. The more critical the mainstream gets of the racial politics in media, the cringier a movie which treats Africa as an exotic backdrop for a white romance becomes. It's hard to watch a scene where Bogart tosses a cigar and a group of black people swarm it like animals with anything but abject horror. As Richard Schickel noted, the original list was compiled predominantly by men in their 50s, who came of age during the 1950s. Consequently, the list shows a bias to movies from that period of formative growth. As those members of the AFI age out and a younger generation takes hold, the boomer picks will slowly fall to the wayside, save a few exceptional films which transcend a mere nostalgic lure. The plurality of canons, the fluidity between them, and the shifting status of the films within reveal that canon has always been a combustible topic. The term suggests a rigid truth carved in stone, but the reality is a chaotic blend of canons, sub-canons, and counter-canons, their contents always in flux. Canon may suggest authority, but that power is widely dispersed through a plethora of different sources. And that suggests that the tyranny of the canon is overstated. The idea of one monolithic force designating which works are canon and which are not simply isn't true. Even if we do accept that the canon created by the AFIs of the world has wider reach than the other canons discussed here, that influence still needs to be qualified. Citizen Kane is the most widely canonized movie of all time. Even when it dropped from Sight and Sound's #1 slot in the last two polls, it's still stuck in the top 3. Everyone knows it's the greatest movie of all time, but it's a mistake to assume everyone is also watching it. This is anecdotal, but I remember taking a course on classical Hollywood in my undergrad, and as the professor introduced the course and discussed the films to be screened, someone brought up Kane. The prof then explained that he wasn't showing Citizen Kane as he assumed all, or at least most students, familiar with it. But when he asked who in the room had seen the film, I raised my hand, and maybe a couple of other students did, but the vast majority had not seen the movie, to the professor's visible surprise. I'm not saying I was better than my classmates or trying to shame my peers for their lack of Kane appreciation. If any of my Film 300 homies are watching, know that I love you. But my point is that knowing the canon is not the same as engaging with it. A central criticism of the canon is that it limits audiences by designating what they should and shouldn't watch. But that assumes the audiences are actually listening. Many are not, and even if they are, The notion that the canon is limiting their viewing assumes that the viewer is engaging with the canon uncritically and is not engaging with anything else. That certainly wasn't my experience. I may have watched through the AFI's top 100 movies, but it's not like I was sitting there passively nodding like, yes, these are the greatest movies of all time. There were plenty of movies I disliked, and that I still dislike. Frankly, at times, I could be too negative. There are a lot of movies that I was openly dismissive of as a teen, but returned to years later and came to like a lot more. And there are still films from that period I owe a revisit. But I was watching critically, and I was also watching other things. The AFI list was not my be-all and end-all. It was an entry point, a way to introduce myself to new eras, styles, actors, and filmmakers that I continued to explore in greater depth on my own. Getting more comfortable with old movies opened me up to international cinema, the famous classics, and the less widely known. As I filled up on narrative cinema, I even began to dip my toes in more experimental works. And these journeys aren't finished. These are avenues I'm still exploring, still hoping for new discoveries. The AFI Top 100 was not a destination, just another port along the way. This is why I can't fully get behind Rosenbaum's critique of the list. It's basic, sure, but we're all basic sometimes. I'm sure the list was uninspired for the 25-year film critic and historian, but for the 15-year-old whose hands were basically glued to his Xbox controller, it was eye-opening. It's for that reason that I think the AFI list is still useful for young cinephiles. It's flawed, to be sure, with massive blind spots, questionable methodology, and poor gendered and racial representation. But as an introduction to a wider world of classic cinema, there's a lot of value. The scattershot quality of the selections is open to criticism, but it also means the list covers a considerable range, from the silent era to the classic studio system, the new Hollywood, even the aftershocks of the indie film boom. The fact that movies as formally and ideologically opposed as MASH and The Sound of Music sit right next to each other is indicative of how wide a sweep the list covers. Could it be wider? Of course it could, but that's why you keep watching beyond the list. As to the quality of the films selected, and if they actually are among the best movies ever made, I mean, some of them are. A lot of them, in fact. Much as it's tempting to act all cool, like I'm above the plebeian picks of the AFI, I can't deny that the list did help shape my tastes. No less than 72 of the films from the original list are in my DVD and Blu-ray collection. Admittedly, some of these were gifts that I didn't strictly choose, or movies I inherited when my partner and I combined our collections, a cornerstone of every great love story. There are also other films in the list that aren't in my collection yet, but I fully plan to add eventually. The Grapes of Wrath will soon be mine for the smashing. There are a lot of good movies here. This is, of course, subjective. Your own mileage may vary, but if you're looking to expand your knowledge of film history, the AFI list is a good start. That's the real value of canons. Not that they tell us what the best movies are, but that they help guide us to new experiences, widening our perspectives and enriching our lives. And that's especially necessary today. The proliferation of streaming services and specialty home video labels have dramatically expanded access to a wide range of movies. No, not everything is available, not by a long shot, but there's an abundance of options that weren't available to the audiences of 1998, or indeed to teenage me in the early 2010s. And the sheer volume of material can be overwhelming. So much great art is at our fingertips. We just need a little guidance to help find it.